We're talking to top economists and finance experts to better understand how the U.S. and the world are getting back to business after the pandemic. Today, I'm talking with Esther Duflo. She's a French-American economist and a Nobel Laureate. Hi, Esther. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
One of the things that the U.S. government did to help people through this crisis was to enhance unemployment benefits, give people even more money than they would normally because they were out of job, often through no fault of their own. But right now there's a big debate as we get through this recovery over whether or not those benefits should continue. Some people think that it's actually disincentivizing people from returning to the workforce. What do you think?
Well, there has been about half a dozen studies of the impact of the $600 weekly benefits when they were in place. And they all came up with the same conclusion that they did not have disincentivizing effects on labor supply. So this came as a surprise to many people. In fact, there was an opinion leader in the Wall Street Journal that said basically the data must be wrong because it doesn't fit with common sense that people would work less if you give them more money not to work. But apparently it was really a solid result. It was replicated by many people. So, of course, this is a very special time, and people, when they had the chance to have a job, they didn't want to let it go. But I think that's still true today. So we would have to study later what is the impact of the now $300 weekly benefits. But on the basis of what we know from the KRS experience, I wouldn't be concerned that this is not the reason why people are not going back to work as quickly as we think they ought to. They also have to find a right job, they have to move for a job, all of that takes time. In general, there is really plenty of experience and data in the world that shows that people really are not that sensitive to this type of programs, that it doesn't make people lazy.
I gotta say, I'm a mom, I've got 3 kids, so this is personal as well as professional. What do you think are the opportunities for reimagining the way that we work and the way that we parent? Is there a new balance that can emerge, and what does it look like? So I think this opportunity is already in the conversation, and in particular it's in the conversation around childcare and financing childcare for everyone. That goes in one direction, which is making sure I think we realize that in the current system is just not very workable. It works just partly work. You know, the women sustain themselves by pulling on their own bootstrap in the best of time, and then we were not in the best of time, and that the bootstrap just like crashed. I took the boots off. I mean, I'm not even wearing boots anymore.
There will be, I think, a wider conversation about what it is to have children, who is responsible for taking care of these children, and whether it's the family alone or whether it's society as a whole. And there the US is a little bit behind in comparison, for example, to continental Europe, where it is understood that children are taken care of by society, not just by the family, and in particular by the woman. So I think we are moving in this direction. The childcare discussion is moving in this direction. And then whether or not how the second half of this conversation that you were implicitly asking is, are we also going to leave some margin to women who have jobs to also take care of their children in a more flexible way? And that I don't know. This is again something I'm not very, very good at predicting the future, and I don't think none of us are. But there is certainly a tendency in the United States for putting a lot of weight on extremely long hours for no particular reason. And as Claudia Goldin has shown, this has been one of the major hindrance standing in the way of women succeeding in careers. So women are less likely to succeed and even start career that demand a very large number of hours, like being a surgeon or a lawyer. And one thing, the next revolution in women's participation in the labor market, as Claudia Goldin argues, is getting rid of this
idea that a good worker is a worker that puts 90 hours a week. Maybe it is just not needed, neither for men nor for women. Maybe we can all work a little bit more reasonable and more flexible hours. And I think the pandemic might have helped with that, because people had to adjust necessarily. I'm curious to see whether it's going to stick or not. I think, I hope that the conversation in the media will help it stick, because I think it will make everyone happier.
I'm wondering if there are things that you've seen across the U.S. that are working, even if it's in small local ways, and things that aren't working. Have there been any lessons that you can take from that sort of individualized approach in the U.S.?
I think one thing we've learned from, again, the world at large, and it's probably true across US states as well, is the key importance of trust, and in particular, trust in government. What we learned in this pandemic is that we needed the government. That before we were, especially in the US, we loved to not love our governments. And since Reagan, we've learned that government was the problem, not the solution. But in this pandemic, suddenly the government had to finance the vaccine and convince people to lock down and convince people to wear masks and so on and so forth. So suddenly the government was at the core of our lives, and therefore the trust in governments at the country level in the world, and I think at the state level in the US, is also correlated with how well the pandemic was managed. So I think this is also maybe something that might stay with us in the future, is if we succeed in, through the vaccinations and the recovery in the economy, if we succeed in putting this behind us, and this is seen as a success in part of a massive government effort by two governments, by the Trump administration followed by the Biden administration, will that to some extent reconcile some of us with the project of government? And that is, I think, an interesting perspective and potentially a hopeful thing to consider.
What can be done to correct the global inequity in vaccine access?
So the global inequality in vaccine access is a shame. It just should be, all the rich countries, not just the US, but Europe as well, should be ashamed, considering that together they are stockpiling about 1 billion excess doses, when something like less than 3% of the world, of the poor part of the world, are vaccinated. And it makes no sense from any perspective. It makes no sense because if a vast number of people are not vaccinated, variants can develop and go back to our countries and potentially make our own vaccines ineffective. It also makes no sense because it makes no sense in a common world not to have some amount of sharing and respect across the world. So we have to correct that quickly. The IMF estimates that it would cost only $50 billion to immunize 4 billion people by the end of next year. This is it. Compared to the $1 trillion that we've spent on stimulus, it is hardly visible. So I think it is great news that the US just committed to give 500 million vaccines, but there are 7 billion people in the world. We need to vaccinate as soon as possible, at least 4 billion of them.
Where do you see the US economy 5 years from now?
Before the pandemic, the US had serious issues. We found it very difficult to talk to each other and solve our problems. The economy, the political world is extremely polarized. There is racism and discrimination and anti-migration feeling that are very raw and very present. And there is also a huge increase in inequality that was made only more apparent and salient during the pandemic, but was very much there before. All these problems seems hard before the pandemics. In fact, I had a book coming out in November before the pandemic called Good Economics for Hard Times. And little did I know the times were going to become so much harder after a few months, but the times were already hard. And something needed to be done to address these issues, and something still needs to be done to address these issues, to tackle inequality, to tackle the place of women in the workforce, to tackle the position, the fact that so many people feel stuck in place and unable to succeed, being people in rural Appalachia or people in black and brown community around the countries. So in the absence of the pandemic, I think it would have been very hard to solve these problems, but maybe the crisis would have come to a head and we would have come to a point where we had to have the conversations that allow them to solve that. The pandemic might have accelerated that. And my hope is that it creates the conditions where we can see that we have so much more in common, so many interests in common in preserving ourselves as society and the world, that it makes our conversations a little bit easier. And I am not seeing that among politicians as yet, sadly, but you're seeing that among people, in the sense, for example, that in polls, when you poll on economic issues, there seems to be a lot of agreement on some basic things. For example, in Florida, at the same time as they voted for Trump in the president's election, they also voted for an increase in the minimum wage to $15 at 60%. So there is tremendous agreement in some economic measures. And that agreement, I think, is more apparent now that the crisis has forced us to confront maybe the fragilities in our lives. And I'm hoping that it will force politicians to convert to that conversations as well. Whether or not they succeed, I think, is the big question mark.